introducing proactive consumer regulation and rebalancing the relationships between landlords and tenants, ensuring that landlords are properly held to account for their performance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the steps that the government is taking to support people living in social housing, but many in Carshalton and Wallington living in social housing are still concerned about the level of service they're receiving from their provider. I've received a number of complaints about a number of housing associations, including Lib Dem-run Sutton Council's housing arm, Sutton Housing Partnership, and Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing in Roundshaw. So can my right honourable friend please assure these residents that when things do go wrong, they do have somewhere to go?
They absolutely do have somewhere to go, and the excellent Member of Parliament for Carshalton and Wallington, who stands up not just for his constituents but for the most vulnerable in society with clarity and moral authority. And our legislation will make sure that MVTH and indeed Lib Dem-led Sutton Council are held to account for any failures.
We now come to topicals. Dame Diana Johnson.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, I was privileged to be invited to join a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, at which we heard from the Community Security Trust about the deeply unfortunate rise in anti-Semitic incidents following the terrorist attack, which we marked earlier in our session today. The increase in anti-Semitic incidents recorded by the Community Security Trust and their partners Tel Mama is 494%. It's a melancholy trend, and I know that everyone in this House will join with me in doing everything we can to defeat anti-Semitism and to promote peace and justice.
Dame Diana Johnson.
I welcome the comments that the Secretary of State has just made, but can I take him to task on some comments he made earlier on? He talked about having conversations with Hull City Council about transport. Of course, this comes after a decade-long refusal of the government to back the electrification of the line to Hull. It also comes after the exclusion of the northern mayors in the debate or the decision to scrap the northern leg of HS2. So why should any of the people in Hull and the East Riding think that they can...
Order. It's... No. Please, it's topicals. It's important. It has to be short and sweet. Just finish very quickly.
So why can they trust what this government ever says to the people of Hull and East Yorkshire?
Well, I'm a huge fan of the Right Honourable Lady, and the proof of the pudding will be in the continued engagement that we have with the people of Hull and indeed with their Liberal Democrat Council.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been running a campaign in my constituency, Fair Deal for New Estates. Basically, it's to ensure that new estates are completed in a timely manner. And I'm not just talking about the housing, but the play areas, the planting, the drainage, the pavements. So will my honourable friend meet with me to discuss this campaign, which is important locally, but it also is achieving progress for residents in Harrogate and Knaresborough?
My right honourable friend is doing an excellent job raising the concerns of his constituents on the floor of the House, and I know that they're shared by many other colleagues. And that's why, through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, we're strengthening planning enforcement powers, including powers to tackle uncompleted developments. I hope his constituents will welcome that, and I'd be pleased to meet him and discuss it in more detail.
We now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to face the right honourable gentleman for our first questions. I hope he enjoyed his party conference, cancelling a meat tax that nobody planned, abolishing 7 bins that don't exist, and announcing that they build a series of transport links that already do exist. So not much conference season, but panto season. So I'll keep my question to a problem that definitely does exist. 1 million families are waiting for social housing. How can you justify handing back to the Treasury billions of pounds desperately needed to tackle the housing crisis?
Because we spend our money effectively. The Affordable Homes Programme, the £11.5 billion investment that we're making, will lead and has led to investment in social and affordable housing across the country. But the Right Honourable Lady has a challenge when it comes to credibility on social housing. She secured the deputy leadership of our party by saying that the Labour Party should be building 100,000 social homes every year, and yet their current target is 0. Why did she retreat?
Rayner.
Mr Speaker, he just comes out with flannel. I think he's auditioning for panto season this afternoon. He can dress it up however he likes. The truth is he couldn't spend this vital funding quickly enough in the middle of a housing crisis. And it's clear the Prime Minister shares the Right Honourable Gentleman's disregard for struggling families. In his hour-long speech in Manchester, the Prime Minister didn't mention housing a single time, not once. But the Housing Minister did tell conference that renters aren't all weed-smoking gangsters, which I'm sure the Minister knows all about that, as he mentioned gangsters earlier today. Can the Secretary of State assure us that despite the tone of those remarks, the Renters Reform Bill will not be scrapped before the King's speech?
Yes, we are bringing reform to the rental market, but I note that at her own party conference, the Honourable Lady shared with the public not just her policies but also her recipe for the future, her recipe in particular for a cocktail called Venom, which apparently contains a bottle of vodka, a bottle of Southern Comfort, 10 blue Wickeds and a litre of orange juice. Well, we know what the real lethal cocktail from the Labour Party is: a mix of unfunded spending commitments, massive borrowing, green-built development and hypocrisy on housing.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the amazing Hope Centre in Northampton that for 50 years has been turning lives around from people who've been homeless, getting them into a home of their own and into a secure job. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating all of the staff and volunteers of this amazing charity?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am delighted to congratulate the staff and volunteers at the Homes Centre for 50 amazing years of supporting vulnerable people in Northampton. This work is critical in meeting the government's commitment to reduce homelessness and to end rough sleeping for good, which is backed by a government investment of £2 billion over 3 years.
SNP spokesperson Adam Kazar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, anti-Semitism is abhorrent. It's hateful, and there must be meaningful legislation to protect Jewish people. And I completely appreciate that this department brought forward the anti-boycott bill to help tackle this. But as the Minister may recall at Bill Committee, it wasn't supported by many human rights organisations and no opposition amendments were accepted. We need to work on a cross-party basis, so the Secretary of State and the Minister meet with me to discuss what support the SNP can provide to tackle the hatred of anti-Semitism.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for the way in which she couched the question. And can I also take this opportunity to thank the First Minister of Scotland, who, in his visit to a synagogue in Edinburgh last week, I think spoke for all of Scotland in expressing his solidarity with the pain being felt by Scotland's Jewish community. And I do look forward to working together on a cross-party basis if we can.
Alan Kearns.
The new Levelling Up Minister has got off to a flying start by awarding £20 million to Barry in the Vale of Glamorgan. Now, Barry is Wales's largest town and has been ignored by the Welsh Government for decades. What reassurance can my honourable friend give me that local priorities will determine how that money should be spent?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend who is a persistent champion of Barry in his constituency. I'm delighted that Barry has been chosen as one of the 55 towns and will be receiving £20 million to deliver their plan, and I look forward to working with him to see Barry's potential realised.
Samantha Dixon.
Chester, like city centres up and down the country, as well as rural and coastal areas, are seeing rents going up and the supply of long-term private rented lets going down. Government consulted on short-term lets earlier this year. What progress has been made in tackling this issue?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this question, and the abuse of short-term lets is a significant issue, as she quite rightly points out, in rural and coastal areas, and we will be responding to the consultation shortly.
Tom Hunt.
Over 200 of my constituents at the mill development in Ipswich have been living in a cruel form of limbo for over 10 years. The building has deep cladding and structural problems. Our SM administrator could run out of money next March and April. My constituents fear they could be turfed out of their homes. What steps have the government taken to support my residents, to give them clarity of their future and come to a lasting settlement that funds the problems in this building and allows them to move on to their lives?
Like my honourable friend, the department and the government wants to see a resolution to the mill which is complex and challenging, but which we absolutely accept the points that my honourable friend is making. I look forward to continue to meeting with my honourable friend and we'll try and find a positive resolution.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Speaker, local authorities are struggling to retrofit ageing rural council housing stock, and it has allowed mould to set in. What will the Minister do to avoid councils having to spend huge sums of council taxpayers' money on positive input ventilation units to provide mould-free homes?
Well, it is the case that the scourge of damp and mould, particularly but not exclusively in the social and private rented sector, is an issue that this government recognises we need to tackle, and that's why we're providing additional support to local government but also to housing associations in order to deal with that issue. I'll look forward to dealing in particular with the honourable gentleman to assess the situation in Tiverton and Hunt.
Scott Benson.
May I thank the Secretary of State for the tremendous support he has already provided to Blackpool, with over £140 million in levelling up monies allocated so far. Is he able to provide an update on the plans for further housing-led regeneration in the Bond Street and Revel areas of my constituency?
Mr Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. I fully recognise the importance of supporting Blackpool and places across the country on their ambitions for regeneration. Homes England and my department are continuing to work closely with Blackpool Council to level up the town and improve the quality of housing, and I look forward to my department saying more about these plans in the future.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State, discussing his bill tomorrow, intends to remove reducing child poverty as a levelling up mission. So can I ask him, does he think it's possible to level up without reducing child poverty, or is it just the case the government doesn't care?
Hear, hear. I think that's probably the warmest response that the honourable gentleman has yet received for a question, but it's a very fair one. And of course we care about reducing child poverty, and that's why the steps that we're taking across 12 levelling up missions, including on education and welfare, are designed to reduce poverty across the United Kingdom.
Siobhan Bailey.
Mr Speaker, Berkeley Town Council have created a much-needed regeneration plan that's going to make it worthy of the tourist attractions nearby, like Berkeley Castle and the Dr Jenner Museum. But we have little faith that the Green and Labour-led District Council will actually get the levelling up bid over the line. It failed before. Their local plans have also been withdrawn. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss the issue?
Absolutely. Look forward to meeting with her and visiting her constituency.
4,240 London households alone were evicted last year using the no-fault possession grounds that the government first promised to scrap 4 years ago. How many more households will be evicted before the government meets its promise?
Well, we are committed to introducing our Renters Reform Bill, which will end Section 21, something that, when Labour were in government, they did not do.
Majesty.
Mr Speaker, levelling up is about levelling up all parts of the United Kingdom, north, south, east and west. Areas which did not get levelling up funding in round 1, 2 and the recent announcements like Gillingham Town Centre. Will the Secretary of State visit Gillingham with me and ensure we get our fair share allocation of resources in Gillingham?
Either I or one of my junior ministers will join my honourable friend in Gillingham.
Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 54 months ago, the government promised the Renters Reform Bill. We're trying again to ask. Since then, 10,000 Londoners have been threatened with eviction. Renting is just simply too insecure. So when will the government be bringing in the Renters Reform Bill?
It's a very good question, and I liked it even better when the member for Westminster North asked it. As I explained, we will be bringing forward our legislation shortly.
Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. He is reforming the NPPF, introducing a new infrastructure levy. How will he ensure that our constituents get the doctors and dentists capacity that must go with new homes?
The infrastructure levy that we are bringing forward will ensure, through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, that the money is there to provide services when new development takes place. We will work with the NHS in order to make sure that GP provision and dental provision is part of that. We have a plan for an infrastructure levy. Labour have no plan.
That completes questions. We now come to the statement by the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
Mr Speaker, the attacks in Israel last weekend shocked the world. Over 1,400 people murdered, one by one, over 3,500 wounded, almost 200 taken hostage. The elderly, men, women, children, babes in arms, murdered, mutilated, burned alive. We should call it by its name. It was a pogrom. Mr. Speaker, the families of some of the missing are in the public gallery today. We call for the immediate release of all hostages. Yeah. And I say to them, we stand with you, we stand with Israel. Yeah. The murdered and the missing come from over 30 countries, including the United Kingdom. The terrible nature of these attacks means it is proving difficult to identify many of the deceased. But with a heavy heart, I can inform the House that at least 6 British citizens were killed. A further 10 are missing, some of whom are feared to be among the dead. We are working with Israel to establish the facts as quickly as possible, and we are supporting the families who are suffering unimaginable pain. We are also helping British citizens who want to leave Israel. We've organised 8 flights so far, bringing out over 500 people, with more flights leaving today. We're working with neighbouring countries on land evacuations for our citizens in Gaza and the West Bank. I've spoken specifically to President Sisi about supporting civilians to leave Gaza by the Rafah border crossing, which at present remains closed. And we have a border force team in Egypt working with our embassy to help citizens when they are able to cross. I will come back to the grave humanitarian situation in Gaza in a moment. But first, Mr. Speaker, I want to address the British Jewish community directly. As I said at Finchley United Synagogue last week and at the Jewish school I visited this morning, we stand with you now and always. Yeah. This atrocity was an existential strike at the very idea of Israel as a safe homeland for the Jewish people. I understand why it has shaken you to your core. And I am sickened that anti-Semitic incidents have increased since the attack. We are doing everything that we can to protect you. We are providing an additional £3 million for the Community Security Trust to protect schools, synagogues, and other Jewish community buildings. And we are working with the police to ensure that hate crime and the glorification of terror is met with the full force of the law. I know the whole House will support this and join me in saying unequivocally, we stand with the Jewish community. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I also recognise that this is a moment of great anguish for British Muslim communities, who are also appalled by Hamas's actions but fearful of the response. We must listen to these concerns with the same attentiveness. Hamas is using innocent Palestinian people as human shields, with the tragic loss of more than 2,600 Palestinian lives, including many children. We mourn the loss of every innocent life, civilians of every faith, every nationality who have been killed. And so, let's say it plainly, we stand with British Muslim communities too. Mr. Speaker, Israel was founded not just as a homeland for the Jewish people, but as a guarantor of their security, to ensure that what happened to the Jewish people in the Holocaust could never happen again. Through its strength and resilience, Israel gradually achieved some of that longed-for security, despite the strategic threats on their borders, including Hezbollah in the north, with Iran at their back. They normalized relations with the UAE and Bahrain through the Abraham Accords, and moved towards normalizing ties with Saudi Arabia, steps that not long ago were thought unthinkable. One reason why this attack is so shocking is that it is a fundamental challenge to any idea of coexistence, which is an essential precursor to peace and stability in the region. Mr. Speaker, the question is, how should we respond? I believe we must support absolutely Israel's right to defend itself. To go after Hamas, take back the hostages, deter further incursions, and strengthen its security for the long term. This must be done in line with international humanitarian law, but also recognizing that they face a vicious enemy that embeds itself behind civilians. As a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians. I repeat President Biden's words. As democracies, we are stronger and more secure when we act according to the rule of law. Humanity, law, decency, respect for human life. That's what sets us apart from the mindless violence of the terrorist. Mr. Speaker, there are 3 specific areas where the United Kingdom is helping to shape events. First, we are working to prevent escalation and further threats against Israel. On Friday, RAF surveillance aircraft began patrols to track threats to regional security. I have deployed a Royal Navy task group to the Eastern Mediterranean, including RFA Lyme Bay and RFA Argus, 3 Merlin helicopters and a company of Royal Marines, ready both to interdict arms and support the humanitarian response. We are bolstering our forces in Cyprus and across the region, and let me be clear, we are not engaging in fighting or an offensive in Gaza, but we are increasing our presence to prevent broader regional instability at this dangerous moment. Second, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we are a long-standing and significant provider of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people. And I can announce today that we are increasing our aid by 1/3 with an additional £10 million of support. An acute humanitarian crisis is unfolding to which we must respond. We must support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. Like our allies, we believe that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people or their legitimate aspirations to live with equal measures of security, freedom, justice, opportunity, and dignity. Hamas simply does not stand for the future that the Palestinians want, and they seek to put the Palestinian people in harm's way. So we must ensure humanitarian support urgently reaches civilians in Gaza. This requires Egypt and Israel to allow in the aid that is so badly needed. We also need to keep the situation in the West Bank in the forefront of our minds at this moment of heightened sensitivity. Earlier today, I spoke to Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, to express our support for his efforts to provide stability. And third, we will use all the tools of British diplomacy to sustain the prospects of peace and stability in the region. Ultimately, that requires security for Israelis and Palestinians and a 2-state solution. So we are increasing our regional engagement. I have spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu twice in the last week, along with the United States, France, Germany, Italy, and others. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, was the first to visit Israel after the attacks. I met with His Majesty, the King of Jordan, yesterday, a long-time voice of reason and moderation. And I have spoken today with the leaders of Turkey and previously Egypt, and will speak to others in the coming days. Our partners in the region have asked us to play a role in preventing further escalation. That is what we will do. However hard it is, we need to ask the tough questions about how we can revive the long-term prospects for a 2-state solution, for normalisation and regional stability, not least because that is precisely what Hamas has been trying to kill. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, unequivocally backing Israel's right to defend itself, stepping forward with humanitarian support, working to protect civilians from harm, and straining every sinew to keep the flame of peace and stability alive. That is our objective. It is the right approach for the region. It is the right approach for Britain, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and for the updates the Government has provided to the Labour frontbench over the past few days. Mr. Speaker, last Saturday, Israel was the victim of terrorism on an unimaginable scale. The senseless murder of men, women, children, even babies. The horrors of hostage-taking. Music festivals turned to killing fields. Innocent Jews slaughtered within their own kibbutz. An attack with no cause other than bloodshed. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that over the last few days, Every member of this House has seen images from this crisis that will never be unseen. Tiny bodies wrapped in bundles in Israel and now in Gaza. Mothers and fathers grieving, Israeli, Palestinian, Muslim, Jew. The innocent dead. As in any time of grave crisis, it is crucial that this House speaks with one voice in condemnation of terror, in support for Israel in its time of agony, and for the dignity of all human life. Because, Mr. Speaker, Hamas do not wish to see peace in the Middle East. They just want to see Israel wiped off the map. But Hamas are not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not Hamas. So Labour stands with Israel. Britain stands with Israel. The attack is ongoing. Terrorists are at large. Hostages are still being held, some of them British citizens. Israel has the right to bring her people home, to defend herself, to keep its people safe. And whilst Hamas has the capability to carry out attacks on Israeli territory, there can be no safety. As Secretary of State Blinken said last week, we democracies distinguish ourselves from terrorists by striving for a different standard, even when it is difficult. He is right. And as the Prime Minister has said, there is an acute humanitarian crisis unfolding. Israel's defence must be conducted in accordance with international law. Civilians must not be targeted. Innocent lives must be protected. There must be humanitarian corridors. There must be humanitarian access, including food, water, electricity and medicines, so that hospitals can keep people alive and so that innocent people do not needlessly die. And there must be proper protection for all those who work selflessly, so aid can be delivered to victims. Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt the responsibility for this crisis lies with Hamas. They have no interest in Palestinian rights, no interest in the security of the people of Gaza. They unleash terror, then hide among them women and children used as human shields, hostages held who should be released. They are destroyers of lives, of hope, of peace, and we cannot give them what they want. We must keep striving for a two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. We cannot give up on that hope, cannot let Hamas brutality be a catalyst for conflict in the wider region. Engagement between Israel and Arab nations must be strengthened, not abandoned. International cooperation, the rule of law, a political road to peace. Hamas want us to abandon all three, and in defiance, we must be resolute on all of them. And Mr. Speaker, these attacks are having a huge impact on communities across the United Kingdom. Many in this House will have heard devastating stories from people who have lost friends and family, people deeply worried about the future of those they know in Israel or Palestine, including the First Minister of Scotland, who I spoke to at the weekend. We stand with all of them, stand against the worrying rise in Islamophobia, stand against the anti-Semitic abuse, threats and assaults we've seen on British streets. Because, Mr. Speaker, we must never underestimate the burden of history the Jewish people carry with them. I do not want Britain to be a place where Jewish schools are closed, Jewish children stay at home out of fear, and Jewish families feel compelled to hide their identity. And I do not want Britain to be a place where British Muslims feel that they have to apologise for the actions of people who do not act in their name. We cannot allow community cohesion in our country to be destroyed. We all bear a responsibility to do all we can to stamp out hate, and we fully support police action to provide extra assistance for our communities. Mr. Speaker, the events of the past week have seen horrors beyond our imagination. So let's send a strong message. Westminster is united. Britain is united with Israel against terror, for international law and the protection of innocent lives. There are difficult days ahead, but our values cannot be compromised. Terror cannot win. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks. And let me just say at the outset, this is an unprecedented and extraordinarily difficult situation and is likely to remain difficult for all of us in the days and weeks ahead. But we must always have in the forefront of our mind that responsibility for this crisis is Hamas and Hamas alone. It was a barbaric act of terrorism that has inflicted untold suffering and misery on so many people, and we have felt that acutely here at home. And we have seen the impact on our streets over the past week, and it has sickened all of us. And we stand united in saying that anti-Semitism has no place in our society. Mr. Speaker, let me be unequivocal that those who incite racial or religious hatred on our streets, that inflict violence, that cause untold suffering to people, will be met with the full force of the law. I know the whole House will join me in making sure that that happens, that the police have all the tools, resources and powers they need to bring that about. And let me also just say, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable gentleman opposite is absolutely right. This House stands united in saying that we condemn unequivocally this terrorist attack by Hamas, stands united in saying that we will be steadfast in our support for Israel, steadfast in our support for the Jewish people, not just today, not just tomorrow, but always.
From the House of Peter Bottom.
The House will be grateful both to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition for the lead they've given in today's statement. This isn't the time to point out the faults of Benjamin Netanyahu. What we have to say is that the inexcusable terror attack on Israelis was intended to bring awful harm to the Palestinians. Rather than quote international leaders, I want to quote a senior constituent who said this is a harrowing time for Jews all over the world. There are about 16 million of us worldwide. Why can't they leave us alone? If we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, we want to try to bring security both to the people of Israel and to the Palestinians in Gaza. And does the Prime Minister know he'll get our support as he tries to do that?
Okay, I thank the Father of the House for what he said and simply agree with his constituent in saying that all of us will pray for peace in the region, but especially for peace for those families who have been so tragically affected by what's happened over the past week.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, Rabbie Burns once poignantly wrote that man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn. And it is with those words echoing in all of our hearts that we send our thoughts and our prayers to all of those suffering in the Middle East. The abhorrent terrorist attack by Hamas on the Jewish people in the Israeli state, it was a crime against our common humanity, and it must be condemned unequivocally. And what more powerful response can we have than to seek to protect the shared innocence and the shared humanity of both Israeli and Palestinian civilians? And what that will require is a lot. It will require the defeat of Hamas. It will require the safe return of all those hostages who have been taken. And it will require the opening of humanitarian corridors so that people can escape Gaza and aid get in. It will require medicine and water and electricity for hospitals so that people who are injured can be treated. It will require no collective punishment. In order to make all that happen, it will require international leadership and international diplomacy. On these isles, that responsibility will fall to the UK Prime Minister, and I very much wish him well in making that happen. And right across this chamber, we all need to be very, very conscious that history will judge us on our response, not just to these abhorrent attacks, but to the humanitarian crisis which is undoubtedly unfolding in Gaza. Let us not be on the wrong side of history.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks and would agree with him that this crisis does demand that the United Kingdom steps up diplomatically to make a difference, to bring about peace and stability, and that is what we have done over the past week. As I alluded to in my statement, Foreign Secretary being the first person to visit Israel and had spoken to multiple of his counterparts, and myself in the same vein, working with allies across the region to make sure that we can work together to bring about a successful and peaceful resolution, but also recognising the scale of the humanitarian situation that is unfolding and playing a leading role in helping to alleviate it, not least with our announcement today of considerably more aid for the Palestinian territories, building on our strong track record as one of the leading providers of aid to the region, and that will continue.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The attack on Israel by Hamas terrorists was barbaric. Terrorists must be defeated, whoever they are, wherever they are. Can I commend my right honourable friend and the Foreign Secretary for the stance that the government has taken in support of the Jewish community here in the UK, in support of Israel and its right to defend itself. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement that action must be taken in line with international humanitarian law. But will he commit today that the government will leave no stone unturned in its efforts to prevent regional escalation of the conflict? And in doing so, will he reflect on the role of Iran?
I thank my right honourable friend. I can give her that reassurance. It's something that we've discussed extensively with partners in the region, but also why last week I deployed surveillance aircraft and assets to the Mediterranean. They are already engaged with ensuring that arms shipments do not find their way to people like Hezbollah, and that Iran does not see this as an opportunity to escalate the conflict. That support that we've put in the region has already been welcomed with our partners, which share our aim in ensuring that this is constrained to dealing with Hamas and what they have done. No one wants to see any escalation, and again, that is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu and I discussed, and he very much agrees that his objective here is to deal with Hamas and not to see this spread more widely.
Ed Davey. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scale of Hamas's terrorist attacks have been utterly horrifying, and the atrocities they have committed are truly sickening. We stand with the people of Israel and with the Jewish community who are grieving and are afraid. We call for the unconditional release of all hostages. And we urge the government to finally prescribe as a terrorist organisation the funders of Hamas, Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Mr. Speaker, Israel unquestionably has the right to defend itself and its citizens. That means targeting Hamas, not innocent civilians, in line with international law. I am concerned about the forced evacuation of hospitals in Gaza, which means death for innocent Palestinians who will not survive being taken off life support. The World Health Organization has said this may be a breach of international humanitarian law. So can the Prime Minister set out what advice he's received on this matter?
Well, Mr. Speaker, unlike Hamas, the Israeli president has said that the Israeli armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and I would just say Israel's attempt to minimise civilian casualties by warning them to leave northern Gaza has actually been further complicated by Hamas terrorists telling the local population not to leave and instead using them as human shields. We will continue to urge Israel, as I have done when I've spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu, that whilst it exercises its absolutely right to defend itself and ensure that these attacks can never happen again, that it takes every possible precaution to minimise the impact to civilians.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Katz.
Saturday's terror attack on Israel constituted crimes against humanity. Crimes so heinous that they violated our understanding of the depths of human depravity, and depravity which continues today as innocents remain held hostage by Hamas terrorists and their patrons, the state of Iran. Israel has a legitimate right to self-defence and to defeat Hamas. And we can support Israel and grieve with their people whilst recognising that how a counter-terrorism operation is conducted matters. It matters because Israel's action as a rule of law nation and our words as their friends shape our ability to be a legitimate arbiter in future conflict and have the right to call out abusers like Russia. And it matters because whilst there is an imperative to defeat Hamas in the immediate to secure Israel's future, how they are defeated will shape the region's future. And because the people of Gaza are not Hamas. 1.2 million children bear no collective guilt for Hamas's terror. So today, Prime Minister, I repeat my call for the creation of a special envoy for the Middle East peace process. And can my right honourable friend tell the House more about what actions are being taken to prevent loss of life and conflict in the West Bank and East Jerusalem? And will we finally prescribe the IRGC?
Well, Mr. Speaker, with regard specifically to the West Bank, this is something that I spoke to the President of the Palestinian Authority this morning about, Mahmoud Abbas, but also yesterday to His Majesty the King of Jordan, and we discussed the measures that are necessary, the support that the UK can provide to ensure the strong stability of the West Bank. No one wants to see the situation escalate there. Can I assure my honourable friend that we are in active dialogue with both of those partners to see how we can help bring that stability to the West Bank, and indeed it's something I also will continue to discuss with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's important that the West Bank remains calm, and that's what we will help to bring about.
Christian Wakefield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, I went to Shul and sat next to a constituent whose cousin is one of the hostages. And my thoughts and prayers go out to not only him, but to all families and hostages currently being detained. Mr. Speaker, whilst conflict escalates in the Middle East, we see the effects on the streets here in Britain. Whilst I welcome the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition's stance on standing behind Israel's right to defend itself and the £3 million increase in funding for the Community Security Trust, unfortunately in the last week we've seen around a 500% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, an 850% increase in suspicious behaviours, and even this weekend, glorification of Hamas and genocidal chants on the streets of our cities, in some cases mere feet away from police officers. So will the Prime Minister join me in applauding the efforts of the CST in keeping the Jewish community safe, but also commit to ensuring that anyone found to be preaching this hate speech on our streets faces the full extent of the law?
Mr. Speaker, I can give the honourable gentleman that assurance. I met with the CST and police chiefs last week in Downing Street, not just to provide extra funding, but to reiterate that there is zero tolerance in the United Kingdom for anti-Semitism. It is tragic that we have seen a significant increase in incidents over the past week, but those who perpetrate these crimes will be met with the full force of the law.
Nadeem Zahali.
I want to add my voice to all those who stand with Israel and her inalienable right to defend herself against an unspeakable crime. As someone born in the Middle East, as a father, as a human, it was too painful to watch. Mr. Speaker, Israel has to take the necessary steps to root out this evil virus of fundamentalism and has so clearly infested those in Hamas and, of course, destroy it. And just as we stood together against ISIS, we will stand together again. But my request to my honourable friend is that when this has been done, that the UK can encourage Israel to set out for all to see the positive actions it will take to change the reality in Gaza once and for all. Gaza and the world will need Israel to show her best self after this war.
I'll thank my honourable friend for his powerful statement, but also agree with him. We must think about the future, and in spite of this awful tragedy, we can't lose sight of the better future that we all want to strive for, and indeed my conversations with leaders have already been thinking about that. It's something I raised with the Prime Minister of Israel as well. We all want that better future for the Israeli and Palestinian people, and hopefully out of this tragedy we will find a way to move closer towards it.
Richard Berger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The massacre of Israeli civilians was a heinous act of terrorism which we all utterly condemn, and the hostages must be released immediately. Mr. Speaker, in the words of the United Nations General Secretary, the horrific acts by Hamas do not justify responding with collective punishment of the Palestinian people. But that is what we're seeing in Gaza. Civilian areas bombed, Food, electricity, water, medicines, all cut off. Such collective punishment is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. So will the Prime Minister take this opportunity to make clear to the Israeli government that this collective punishment of Palestinian civilians must end immediately?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd say gently to the honourable gentleman that I actually believe that we should support absolutely Israel's right to defend itself and to go after Hamas, and recognising that they face a vicious enemy that embeds itself behind civilians. Now, of course, Israel will act within international humanitarian law, and as a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution in avoiding harming citizens, but we must acknowledge always the responsibility for what is happening here is Hamas, and Hamas alone.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you. And, Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for the step you took at the beginning of last week in lighting up this palace in the colours of blue and white as an act of solidarity with the Israeli victims of Hamas terrorism. I know it was appreciated by those British families who are mourning loved ones who were slain in that action, and also by families who are living with unimaginable fear right now because they have family members taken hostage in Gaza, and some of those family members are with us in the gallery this afternoon. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that after the acts of barbarism by Hamas, there is no going back to the situation as it was before, when right under the noses of the international community, Hamas were allowed to rearm time and again, were allowed to misappropriate aid into terrorist infrastructure, building those tunnels, amassing armaments, hiding them behind civilian families? And does he agree with me that the international community must make a stand and not allow the Gaza Strip to go back to becoming a terrorist statelet?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend for everything he does to support the Jewish community here and overseas, and I agree with him. No country can or would tolerate the slaughter of its citizens and simply return to the conditions that allowed that to take place. Israel has the right, indeed the obligation, to defend itself and to ensure that this never happens again.
Charlotte Nettles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No stone can remain unturned in finding a political solution. Not my words, but the words of the Israeli and Arab Mothers Collective, Women Wage Peace, echoed in recent days by survivors from Kibbutz Be'eri, family of those murdered at Nativ HaSarah, organisations like B'Tselem, Omdim Ben Yachad, and thousands of peace activists and ordinary Israelis desperately praying for the cycle of violence to end and a lasting peace to be secured. What will the government be doing to heed that call and mobilise international actors to find this political solution, however far away it feels right now, so that there may be a way out of the nightmare Hamas have unleashed for all in Israel, Palestine and the wider region for good?
Mr. Speaker, we must provide an alternative to the vision of violence and fear and terror that is presented by Hamas, and that is what the United Kingdom will do. Standing with Israel, but also working together with its people and our allies across the region, all of those who remain committed to a vision of a more peaceful, more integrated, more secure and more prosperous Middle East. That's what we will work towards.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, and in particular his urging of the State of Israel to act in line with international humanitarian law, and particularly welcome his call for Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming the civilians. Can I also ask my right honourable friend to press upon our Israeli friends the principles of distinction and proportionality in their action, and to avoid any sense in which it looks like a collective punishment is being meted out to the Palestinians in Gaza, as well as ensuring that we do nothing that is going to leave the democracies worse off at the end of this, and not in line with the principles that all of us would wish to hold.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and as I said, we support Israel's right to defend itself, but as a friend we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians. This is something I specifically discussed with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we will continue to do so.
Abdul Khan.
A 6-year-old Palestinian child was murdered in Chicago because of his Muslim faith, and as a response, to the war between Israel and Hamas. In the last week, we have seen a sharp rise in Islamophobia rhetoric and the dehumanization of Palestinians, and tragically, yesterday we saw the consequences of this in the murder of this little boy. Will the Prime Minister review his statements about the conflict and ensure he does not add to the further vilification of Palestinians and Muslims when condemning the actions of Hamas?
Mr. Speaker, I just gently urge the honourable gentleman to examine what I said from this dispatch box earlier, particularly about standing with the British Muslim community at this difficult time. We will not tolerate, Mr. Speaker, anti-Muslim hatred in any form, and will seek to stamp it out wherever it occurs. I'm pleased to say in June of this year, the Security Minister confirmed additional funding of £24.5 million available this financial year to provide protective security at mosques and Muslim faith schools as a demonstration of our intent to deliver on what I said. But I would say to the Honourable Gentleman, please see what I did say earlier from this dispatch box. We stand with all communities at this difficult time.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Speaker, in the long litany of attacks against Jews around the world, this is the single most murderous attack on Jews since the end of the Holocaust in 1945, and his support for the Jewish community in this country and for Israel has been heroic. This is an historic moment, and the response of His Majesty's government has been all anyone could have asked. Will the Prime Minister agree that Israel has acted entirely in accordance with international law, despite Hamas using human shields and every type of horrific provocation? And Israel not only has a right to defend itself, but in fact a duty to defend its people from sadistic and vicious murderers.
I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point. It does not just have the right, it does have a duty. One only needs to imagine if a similar incident had occurred in our country, what we would do to secure the safety and security of our citizens. That is what Israel is doing, and they have, as I said, every right and every duty to do so, and they shall have our support as they do.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I condemn unreservedly the actions of Hamas and the horror that has unfolded in the region, and ask that the hostages are returned safely as soon as possible. However, the reality of the evacuation order on the ground, speaking to aid workers based in Gaza, is that people cannot get out. People who are ill, frail, in hospital, or just getting old cannot get out. And actually, this morning I've spoken to aid workers where people are returning from southern Gaza to northern Gaza because they have no water, there's nowhere to go, they can't escape. Can I ask the Prime Minister to urge the Israeli government to bear in mind the reality of ordinary Palestinian people living in the nightmare that is unfolding around them through no fault of their own?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we've spoken, and I've spoken to President Sisi about the importance of the Rafah crossing being open for humanitarian purposes. We'll continue to do so, and also about the importance of allowing humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza, and the announcement today of more support will hopefully make a difference. But again, I would just contrast Israel's attempt to minimise civilian casualties by warning people to leave Gaza compared to Hamas, which is urging the local population to stay and use them as human shields. It's unacceptable, and we should call it out for what it is.
Andrew Percy.
Mr. Speaker, every tragic loss of life in Gaza is the responsibility of Hamas and Hamas alone, and some people in this place would do well to remember that fact, Mr. Speaker. A week on from these pogroms, what did we have on the streets of Britain? Some people attending pro-Palestinian marches, holding up banners in support of terrorists, whether it be hang gliders, whether it be chanting anti-Jewish chants, whether it be supporting the racist BDS movement, or in the case of a protest in Glasgow, reminding Jews where they were in 1940. Jews need no reminder of where they were in 1940, Mr. Speaker. These scenes are deeply distressing to British Jews, and many British Jews do not believe the police are going to take action. So can I urge the Prime Minister to look at what some of our European partners are doing and looking at taking stronger action against some of these marches?
Well said, Andrew. Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for everything he does to support the Jewish community in our country. And let me join with him in saying these acts are appalling, and I want to make sure that we provide security and release and relieve that anxiety to the Jewish community here in the United Kingdom, which is why I took steps very quickly last week to provide that reassurance. And I am clear, where people incite racial or religious hatred, or where people's conduct is threatening, abusive or disorderly, or causes distress to others, we expect the police to take action, and that those committing those crimes should face the full force of the law.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I join this House in its condemnation of the bloodshed in Israel and Palestine. Mr. Speaker, the 2 million Palestinians in the open-air prison of Gaza faced a dire humanitarian emergency long before today. Yet indiscriminate airstrikes and siege tactics have turned what was a critical emergency into a devastating catastrophe. Will the Prime Minister make it clear to the Israeli government that laying siege to civilians in Gaza by cutting food, water, power and medical supplies and indiscriminate airstrikes killing civilians is in clear violation of international law, and just what is the international community doing to stop the horrific and inhumane treatment of Palestinians?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I again just gently point out to the honourable gentleman that the entity responsible for the suffering we are seeing is Hamas, and Hamas. Now, of course, we in the international community will do our best to alleviate the impact on innocent people, which is why today we've announced further aid to the region. We will make sure that we provide as much humanitarian support as we can, and indeed in all our conversations with leaders around the region, we're discussing the humanitarian situation and finding ways to work together to alleviate the impact on innocent lives, and that's what we will continue to do.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Speaker, does the Prime Minister accept that what Hamas did was not terrorism for its own sake, but an act of calculated barbarism with a strategy behind it? And does he agree with me that that strategy is to ensure that whereas the present war will not feature Egypt and Jordan as enemies of Israel, as was the case in previous wars, their strategy is to try and prevent similar peace agreements with countries like Saudi Arabia? And finally, does he accept that Hamas is a creature of a client state of Russia? And while we're talking about this, we must remember that Russia is still at war in Ukraine.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's right to point to the broader situation and right to welcome the progress that had been made on normalisation between Israel and other countries in the region, which speaks to the brighter future that all of us hope we will see one day. But let me reassure him on our support for the Ukraine. We all remain committed to that, and just this Friday I was at the JEF summit in Sweden talking with our Northern European, Scandinavian, Baltic partners and hearing directly from President Zelensky about how we in the JEF will continue to support Ukraine over the coming year, so he can be reassured that we are able to do both.
Don Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, Noam Sagi, his wife Mikhail and their son are here today, and they're watching you give your statement. Ada Sagi, Noam's mum, has been taken hostage by Hamas on Saturday the 7th of October from her home and is currently being held in Gaza. Ada booked a ticket to the UK to celebrate her 75th birthday. Noam has written to you asking for your immediate intervention and assistance. Joe Biden has made personal calls to his citizens. I'm asking if you will please, and remember the family are watching you, Prime Minister, will you please just spare 5 minutes, just 5 minutes to have a quick conversation?
Mr. Speaker, of course I'm happy to have a quick conversation, but I'm also engaged actively with our partners in the region to try and ensure the safe release of our hostages, something which I'm sure the House will support me in doing any which way we can. We will use all the tools at our disposal to ensure their safe return, not just for the Honourable Lady's constituent, but all of those British nationals and others who have been taken by Hamas in this appalling act. They should know that we are doing absolutely everything we can to try and bring them back home as safely and as quickly as possible.
Priti Patel.
We in this House are all absolutely horrified by the terrorist atrocities on Israel and the appalling way the Hamas terrorists have murdered, tortured and kidnapped men, women and children. And I do thank the Prime Minister today for his very, very important and significant statement, and actually for the way in which he's just said that we are giving all the support to those grieving families right now. That is absolutely paramount. Could the Prime Minister explain through his conversations with President Sisi how the opening of the border crossings between Gaza and Egypt on humanitarian grounds will be undertaken in a way that prevents the Hamas terrorists from leaving and potentially creating further atrocities in the region?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and that is why there is complexity to opening the Rafah border crossing, but she should be reassured we're engaged in those conversations, both with the Egyptians and other partners, including the Americans, to find a safe way to open that crossing, both ideally for the evacuation of British nationals that may be in Gaza, but also to provide humanitarian support into Gaza, which I know we would all like to see happen.
Sarah Chet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The International Committee of the Red Cross stated that hospitals in Gaza risk turning into morgues without electricity. The UNRWA Commissioner General has also said their colleagues in Gaza are no longer able to provide humanitarian assistance, and the number of people seeking shelter in UNRWA facilities in the south is absolutely overwhelming. Some civilians have no choice but to stay in the north of Gaza and must be protected at all times. So, Prime Minister, what conversations have you had with your Israeli counterpart on creating safe zones and humanitarian corridors in Gaza? Has the Prime Minister raised the urgent need to prevent atrocities on all civilians? And will the Prime Minister increase financial support to UNRWA and the surrounding host nations as the increasing needs of refugees from Palestine will only, sadly, increase?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that over the past few years we've been one of the leading donors to the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, accounting for about 10% of all their support to the region. And again, today we announced an increase in our humanitarian support by around a third, and we will work with the relevant partners to see how best for that funding to make a difference in the region as quickly as possible.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Speaker. And can I thank you for allowing us a 1 minute silence to reflect on the victims in the Middle East that have taken place. There can be no greater contrast between the actions of the IDF, who attempt to prevent the loss of civilian life, compared to the sheer brutality of the terrorists who kill and maim as many people as they possibly can. There can be just no comparison between those two aspects. This operation by the terrorist group Hamas was clearly well planned, well resourced, well equipped, and had been planned for many months. It is beyond belief that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who fund and support Hamas, were not behind this whole operation. So will my right honourable friend now take the action that the whole House has asked him to take, and that's to prescribe the IRGC in its entirety?
Mr. Speaker, we have already taken strong action against the Iranian regime, including sanctioning 350 different individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety. And furthermore, the National Security Act implements new measures to protect the British public, including new offences for espionage, foreign interference, and tougher powers to arrest and detain people suspected of involvement in state threats. As the House knows, the government has a long-standing policy of not commenting on whether specific organisations are being considered for prescription, and our approach, as currently stated, is completely aligned with that of our allies.
Samuel Wilson.
The Israeli government has the right, indeed the duty, to protect its civilians against these bloody terrorist attacks, and we wish the Prime Minister well in his advice and his guidance to the Israeli government to achieve the aims which they need to achieve in protecting their citizens. The Prime Minister's statement indicated that we would not tolerate the glorification of terror, and it will be met by the full force of the law. Will you therefore join my condemnation of the Irish language school in West Belfast, where the students had pro-Palestinian demonstrations this week? They were facilitated within the school, and would you agree with me that schools should be places where pupils are taught it's morally wrong to support terrorism and they should not facilitate such demonstrations?
Well, thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks. Without obviously knowing the details of the incident he describes, of course it's right that schools should not be a place where this malicious activity is happening. We are absolutely clear that under the Terrorism Acts, both of 2000 and 2006, it is an offence to encourage terrorism, and it is also a range of offences to glorify or support groups which have been prescribed as terrorist organisations under UK law. The police will use all the tools at their disposal to stamp that out and arrest those who perpetrate those acts.
Colin Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the many things that Bournemouth is known for, Mr. Speaker, is its large Jewish community. Indeed, our first citizen and Mayor Councillor Anne Filer is herself Jewish. Those people in my constituency will have heard and drawn comfort from the calm and measured words, not just of the Prime Minister, but of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, this afternoon. What we have seen is not just an attack on the territorial integrity of Israel. What we have seen is an attack on Jews and those of the Jewish faith. Will my right honourable friend join everyone else of goodwill in this House to make clear, not just this week, last week, this month, next month, but always that anti-Semitism has no place in our society?
Yeah. I agree with my right honourable friend. What this was an attack on Jews, and we should call it out for what it was. That's what Hamas believes, that's what Hamas has tried to do, and they will meet firm resistance from us, and we will not tolerate anti-Semitism in any form on our streets, not just today, not just tomorrow, but always.
Taureen Kelly. Taureen Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister reaffirmed his commitment to a two-state solution. Why then has his government failed to recognise the state of Palestine when 138 United Nations member countries have done so? Israel has absolutely every right to defend itself. Palestinians need to have that right as well. In doing so, by recognising Palestine as a state, Palestine will be able to root out terrorism and defend its territory. Does the unjustifiable actions of Hamas, a group that does not represent Palestinians, justify the collective punishment of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza by the Israeli Defence Forces?
Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom government's long-standing position under both parties for some time has been that the United Kingdom will recognise a Palestinian state at a time when it best serves the object of peace. We are committed to the objective of a sovereign, prosperous and peaceful Palestinian state living side by side with a safe and secure Israel. And as last week's attack demonstrates, that right now we must ensure that Israel has that security.
Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that to conflate Hamas and the Palestinians is not only wrong but dangerous? Yes. Hamas have abducted, tortured and executed Palestinian members of Fatah. They have broken the arms of children who have worn Fatah colours to school. And they do not want a two-state solution because they don't believe Israel should exist as a state. But if the fingers on the trigger were Hamas, the strings being pulled were from Tehran. With £100 million of investment going from Tehran to the terrorists of Hamas, isn't it time that we in this country asked again why Iranian banks are operating from the City of London, why Iran Air is operating from Heathrow Airport, and why, again, we have not prescribed the IRGC as I believe we should have?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my right honourable friend that Hamas, crucially, the Palestinian people are also the victims of Hamas. As he said, Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinian people or their legitimate aspirations to live with security and dignity. It does not stand for the future that Palestinian people want, and he is right to highlight that, and that is why we've taken the approach that we have, and we believe and we will continue to make sure that our sanctions regime is effective. Where we have sanctioned entities, including banks, we will ensure that those sanctions are complied with, and the new Economic Deterrence Institute that we have established with funding will help make sure that that happens.
Agreement.
Speaker, I'd like to join with others and condemn the atrocities of Hamas, and my thoughts are with all of those affected by the conflict in Israel and Gaza. One of my constituents, a UK national, is trapped in Gaza, having travelled there on Friday the 6th of October. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, FCDO staff and Labour's front bench for the work that they've been doing to try and bring my constituent home. I wrote to the Secretary of State on Friday to update him regarding my constituent's whereabouts, so I asked the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State to redouble their efforts to bring my constituent home, ensure the safe passage of all of the UK nationals trapped in Gaza, and to work to support people both in Gaza and Israel caught up in this terrible conflict.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question and express my sympathies to her constituent and their family. We are in touch with all those families that have registered with the Foreign Office to provide consular assistance to them. Obviously the situation in Gaza is difficult, but we're doing everything we can, not least our conversations with the Egyptians about the Rafah crossing, but we have preemptively deployed a border force rapid deployment team to Egypt so that when and if the crossing is opened, we are able to extract our citizens and bring them home, and that is something that I've also explicitly discussed with President Sisi to receive assurances from the Egyptians that they will allow safe passage of British nationals when the time allows, and she can rest assured that for her constituent and all others that are trapped, we will continue to do everything we can to support them.
Get Maltose.
Mr. Speaker, modern media brought the full horror of the profoundly evil crimes committed against the State of Israel into all our homes. And it's also now bringing the unfolding horror of the human catastrophe taking place in Gaza into our sitting rooms as well. In his statement, the Prime Minister indicated that Israel and Egypt are denying access for humanitarian aid into Gaza. What possible reason could they be giving for that?
Mr. Speaker, as we heard previously, there are complexities with ensuring the safe opening of the Rafah crossing, and we're having conversations both with the Israelis and the Egyptians and other partners to see how best we can provide humanitarian assistance to the region, not least with the deployment of our Royal Navy assets, which will arrive over the course of the coming week, but also the increase in the aid funding that we've announced today that will provide support to people in the region.
Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The use of white phosphorus in a densely populated area against civilians is illegal. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have reported the use of white phosphorus against civilians in Gaza. Can I ask the Prime Minister, has the British Foreign Office received confirmation of any such reports, and if such weapons have been used against civilian populations in Gaza, what will his response be?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course we keep everything under review, but I'm not going to comment on or speculate on reports where we do not have full access to information or are unable to verify facts.
Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement and the three-step approach. Terrorism is terrorism, and as somebody who comes from a Muslim background, can I just say this? With regards to the actions that we saw with regards to Hamas, they were clearly terrorist and barbaric, and therefore everything must be done to confront that terrorist organisation. I say this to the Prime Minister with regards to the previous work I did as the former envoy for freedom of religion or belief, working with people from the Muslim, Jewish and the Christian faith. We worked together to tackle intolerance against all people of all faith. On the specific point with regards to the conversation he's had with King Abdullah, Hamas will be defeated. The question is, who replaces Hamas in Gaza? Has he had conversations with King Abdullah with regards to if President Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority is prepared to step in with the support of international partners and humanitarian assistance, because everything must be done to preserve human lives and find a two-state solution in this matter?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his excellent question and reassure him that that is exactly part of the conversation that I've had both yesterday with the King of Jordan but also today with President Abbas. We do need to provide stable leadership in Gaza once Hamas has hopefully been removed, and that thinking is already happening amongst us and our partners.
Ms Saville-Roberts.
Like Cymru, I condemn the atrocities of Hamas, and our thoughts are with all the Israeli and Palestinian civilians killed, injured or bereaved in this horrific conflict. International humanitarian law exists for a reason, to safeguard all civilians, universally. Among these rights is the right to water. Fuel is necessary for many people in Palestine to have safe drinking water. Without clean water, people will die. He has announced humanitarian support today, which I welcome. As a close ally of Israel, what steps has he taken to urge Israel to comply fully with international law, including by supplying essential fuel to Gaza?
Mr. Speaker, as I said previously, as a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, and we will continue to do everything we can to provide humanitarian support to those affected.
Ian Duncan-Smith, Sir Ian.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend for his calm leadership through the last few days, and that also of the Leader of the Opposition too. Can I just say that some people forget that the reason we defend Israel's right to exist and its security is that 6 million Jews were murdered by a perverted ideology, and we must never return to that again. That's why we stand with Israel in its time of absolute need. But I don't know whether he saw this, but over the weekend, I have a Jewish sister-in-law, and she was quite clear that she has never felt more threatened than over the weekend when people took to the streets waving flags bearing Hamas's crest on them, calling out to sweep Israel from the river to the sea. Is all about getting rid of Jews in Palestine. There is no other question. So we really have to be very clear that we have to protect these Jewish people here who are British citizens, and we must stamp out anti-Semitism. And I therefore ask my right honourable friend whether now we will redouble our efforts to make sure that if ever that happens again, those people bearing those flags, hurling that abuse, will be arrested and prosecuted with the full strength of the law.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his excellent contribution, and he is right. There is no place for demonstrations, convoys, or flag waving on British streets that glorifies terrorism or harasses the Jewish community. That's why I met last week with police chiefs and the Community Safety Security Trust in Downing Street to discuss how better we can protect the Jewish community at this time and police these protests appropriately. And I'm pleased that that work is ongoing, but of course we will remain engaged with all partners to, as he said, anyone who breaks the law should see them be met with the full force of the law and be swiftly arrested. And I'll also reassure him that many people will have seen incidents online and footage of scenes that are simply unacceptable. The police are currently reviewing that footage, and where possible and where they can, they will further arrest those responsible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The acts of terror that were committed by Hamas were horrifying, and our prayers go out to everyone affected, both in Israel and across the world, and those who are here in the House today. Israel is seeking justice, but innocent Palestinians must not pay the collective price. I urge the Prime Minister to seek guarantees from the Israeli government on 4 crucial points. Firstly, that incendiary weapons will not be used in civilian areas. Second, that hospitals and medics will not be targeted. Third, that food, water and electricity supplies must be immediately restored. And finally, we must not see military occupation and annexation of Gazan land.
Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that the Prime Minister of Israel does not want to see any regional escalation beyond dealing with Hamas, and as a friend we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Jonathan Chinodgley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Hamas terrorist attack, the unequivocal government support and concern for the safety and welfare of the UK Jewish community has been extremely well received by the Jewish community. And no one has shown greater care than my right honourable friend, who I would like to thank. Over the coming days, as Israel takes the remedial action and self-defence action that it has been forced to take, can my right honourable friend confirm that he will work with our international allies to ensure continued support for Israel, such that Israel is not left out on a limb on its own to be picked off by enemies?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his kind words and agree with him that we will continue to support absolutely Israel's right to defend itself and remain engaged in the region, talking to our partners to provide them with the support that we can, defend their position, and also to provide humanitarian support to alleviate the impact best we can.
Commissioner Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts and prayers are with all the families who are grieving following the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas, which I condemn unreservedly. These atrocities were committed by terrorists who do not seek peace and have set back the just cause of Palestinian freedom and statehood, which I have long supported, along with many across this House. Over 1 million Palestinians in Gaza have been told to flee, highlighting the scale of the impending humanitarian disaster, which will only inflame tension in the region. There are grave concerns about escalation of this conflict in the wider region. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what particular steps our government is taking to help de-escalate the conflict, which runs the risk of turning this into a wider regional conflict, drawing in Lebanon and Iran?
Well, both the Foreign Secretary and I are speaking extensively to all our partners in the region to urge everybody to put pressure on those who would seek to take advantage of the situation not to. And we have deployed, as I said, surveillance aircraft to the Mediterranean, not least to ensure that Hezbollah is not in receipt of extra arms shipments, because that would be something that would be damaging to regional stability, and we'll continue to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Matthew Wofford.
2013, I took a group of school children from the Bet Shidda primary school in Edgware to the Hanukkah party at number 10. A leading voice of the choir was Nathaniel Young, one of the first people to be killed in the terrorist attack in Israel. Can the Prime Minister advise the House what actions have been taken to the bereaved families and also the families of the 17 hostages who remain in Gaza, and what consular support will that entail?
Well, I express again my sympathies to all those families who have been impacted by the appalling situation in Israel and this terrorist attack. I was in Nathaniel's constituency, my honourable friend's constituency this morning, and seeing firsthand the impact that this was having on the community there. And can I assure my honourable friend that the Foreign Office are providing extensive consular support to all those families that are impacted, and we will continue to do so throughout this crisis.
Adam Kesa.
Mr. Speaker, I refer members to my register of interests. I wish to put on the record my utter condemnation of the Hamas attacks. Israeli hostages must be released. Over the last week, we've all seen horrific images of innocent Israelis and Palestinians on our screens. It's been awful. And what struck me is a quote that I've seen from an aid worker in Gaza, Medical Aid for Palestinians, Mahmoud Shalabi, has said, "I've seen kids write their names on their palms because when they die, they want people to know who they are." That's because in Gaza, families are being wiped out. Across the globe, there's been collective outcry for the people of Gaza, most of whom, as the Prime Minister has said, have nothing to do with Hamas. Has the Prime Minister pledged funding or support for the safety of children and their access to healthcare and hospitals? And what is the Prime Minister doing to facilitate the opening of the border for aid? Humanitarian access is so important, and so foreign nationals can leave Gaza. Here.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've specifically spoken to President Sisi about the importance of opening the Rafah border crossing, both for humanitarian purposes and to provide for the safe evacuation of British nationals. And today we've announced an increase in our aid funding to the region by around a third, and we will figure out how best that money can help those who need it as quickly as possible.
Sir William Cash.
As to international law and media impartiality, will the Attorney-General be asked to provide a legal note, if not a full opinion, given, for example, that one of Ofcom's directors, Ofcom having itself full statutory responsibility and regulatory responsibility of all visual and oral media, including the BBC, is reported to be supporting posts this week itself, arguing that the government's support for Israel is a vile colonial alliance, referring to ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians, and Ofcom must surely be told that it must deal with this at once as a matter of impartiality, quite apart from any criminal action that may be needed under terrorist or criminal law?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I'm sure that the attorney looks into it, and more generally just say I absolutely endorse those describing these attacks, calling them what they are, which are acts of terror by a terrorist organisation. Obviously, the BBC is editorially and operationally independent of government, but the Culture Secretary raised that specific issue with the BBC Director General last week.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Hamas's kidnapping of 200 Israelis is a stark reminder that the terrorist group has learnt from its paymasters, the Iranian regime, who for years have promoted state hostage-taking, including, of course, UK nationals. So can the Prime Minister say a little bit more about the steps that the UK government is taking for the release of the British nationals who are currently held in Gaza?
As I said, we're providing consular support to families that are affected. We recognise this will be a very difficult time for them. It's also why, for a long time, we have maintained a do not travel Foreign Office travel advice to Gaza, because we know the situation is dangerous, and we're working as hard as we can to open the Rafah crossing, and the Border Force team has already been deployed to Egypt, so that if and when that crossing is opened, we are rapidly in a position to be able to bring people home.
Bayer Selwood.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome the Prime Minister's most powerful statement today in robustly standing with Israel in its mission to defeat Hamas after its brutal terrorist offensive last week. This has rightly been called Israel's 9/11, but following those attacks on America in 2001, we now appreciate there were grave operational and strategic errors were made, however well-intentioned, in the name of defeating terrorism. That led to significant escalation and indeed radicalisation. So how events play out in the next few days will have severe repercussions across the Middle East and beyond for years. And with no emergency governance, security or humanitarian plans yet confirmed, does the Prime Minister agree with me that if we are a true friend of Israel, we should counsel against a full-scale ground invasion at this time, as it will see this conflict spill into the West Bank, East Jerusalem and southern Lebanon?
I'm just before everybody comes back in, there's still lots to stand. I want to get everybody in because I think it's right. But please, let's consider each other in both questions and answers. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd say, of course, every country has the right to defend itself, and it wouldn't be appropriate for the UK to define that approach. But as I said, we will continue to stand with Israel. I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his remarks, but also, as I said, as a friend, urge them to take every possible precaution to minimise the impact on civilians.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you're aware, my immediate family is from the West Bank, but we have extended family in Gaza City. Their house was bombed by the IDF. They went to seek sanctuary in a church because we're Christian Palestinians. And I'm afraid to say they're still there because they're too old to go, and they say to me that they have nowhere to go. Mr. Speaker, because of this, not despite it, I attended a vigil in Oxford organised by the Jewish community, because it is between our communities that we now share profound emotions, loss and grief. And when the Prime Minister says never again, I agree with him. So will he give his assurance that it will be never again? That whenever we get through whatever is going to happen in the next few days, that he keeps the promise he made to my great-grandfather, and that there will be a Palestinian state to call our own at the end of it?
Well, can I start by expressing my sympathies to the Honourable Lady and her family for what they're going through. I know it will be an incredibly difficult time for them, but can I also pay tribute to her that in spite of that, her presence at the vigil would have meant an enormous amount to many people, and the courage she has to talk about that experience here today is also admirable, and the fact that she looks forward to a more positive future. It's an ambition that I share, and this is an unspeakably difficult situation. It is a tragedy, but we must find a way to move forward to secure a more stable, peaceful settlement for those living in the Middle East, because this tragedy has reminded us all of the horrors of war, the horrors of terrorism, and we must find a way to bring peace and stability to the region, and that's what I will strive very hard to help bring about.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a child of Northern Ireland, I'll never forget how frightened it is to be in a schoolroom when a bomb goes across the road. And the Hamas atrocities of last weekend rewrote the definition of evil. The Prime Minister is right to have condemned Hamas. He's right to have stood beside the Jewish population. He's right to stand by Israel's duty to defend itself. But our history also tells us that terrorism is rarely defeated by further terror. So he is right to also be concerned for innocent Palestinians caught in the crossfire used as human shields. Can I thank him for what he said about Israel's need to stay within international law and for the extra additional aid that we have pledged today? And can I urge him to try and get that aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible?
I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, but also can give her that reassurance, and I know she will have advice for us on how best we can do that. We're keen to make sure that aid makes a difference to as many people as quickly as possible, and we'll be working with partners to make sure that that happens.
Jessica Litt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hamas knew what would happen to the people that they purport to represent after their atrocious terrorist actions. They knew it would rain down fear and pain and killing in the region. Anybody in our country who purports to support them deserves, as the Prime Minister says, the full force of the law. The Prime Minister, I thank him for saying that more aid will be going to Gaza, but I want to know, in conversations that he has had with Israel, which he has said he had today, what progress has actually been made to ensure that that aid, medical supplies, fuel, namely water, is actually going to reach the people of Gaza. As my honourable friend from Sunderland has already said, people have nowhere to go, nothing is getting through, so what is Israel going to do to ensure that British aid can reach Gazans?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's also important that Egypt is involved in that conversation because of the Rafah crossing being one of the primary routes for aid to reach into Gaza, and that's why we've spoken specifically with President Sisi about that, and we'll continue to talk with him and other regional allies to find ways to bring humanitarian aid to the region as quickly as possible.
Robert Butler.
I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and his unequivocal condemnation of calculated acts of murder and hostage taking, which are deliberately designed to provoke a response that plunges the entire region, if not the wider world, into greater conflict. What assessment is my right honourable friend of the government making of current escalations on the northern border of Israel and Lebanon? We hear this afternoon of an evacuation of Israeli citizens within 2 kilometres of the border. Does he think that this might well be a further escalation of the situation and all part of a calculated plan to plunge the region into chaos?
Mr. Speaker, we absolutely don't want to see regional escalation, and one of the ways we can help ensure that doesn't happen, he specifically mentioned Lebanon, is the deployment of our surveillance assets, which went into the region last week with further to follow by the end of this week. And for example, one of the things they can do is track and interdict arms shipments that might be going into Hezbollah, for example, something that none of us will want to see, which is why we've deployed those assets, and partners are grateful for our intervention because no one wants to see an escalation of this conflict.
Catherine Smith.
Some of the most vulnerable citizens in the event of war are people with disabilities. So can I ask the Prime Minister what representations the government has made for the protection, particularly of people with disabilities in northern Gaza who are unable to move?
Mr. Speaker, in all our conversations, we'll continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians and do everything we can to bring humanitarian support to the region.
During the Prime Minister's school visit this morning, we heard incredibly powerful speeches from students about the situation, showing the anguish felt about the worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. So in light of that, will he ensure that the unequivocal support for Israel that is expressed today is maintained and doesn't weaken in the difficult days ahead as Israel does what it has to do to remove the capacity of Hamas ever to do this again.
Can I thank my honourable friend for welcoming me to her constituency this morning and for joining with me in what was an incredibly powerful visit to one of her local schools, and I praise the courage and eloquence of the students that we heard, who were incredible in explaining how this has affected them and their families. And she has my assurance we will continue to stand with Israel, as I said this morning, not just today, not just tomorrow, but always.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is absolutely right to say that the unspeakable actions of Hamas means that Israel not simply has the right but a duty to protect its own citizens. But Israel also has a duty to protect innocent Palestinians. And I must ask the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, with Israel cutting off food, cutting off water, how does this seriously bring the hostages home? How does it seriously help to defeat Hamas?
Mr. Speaker, it's not right for us to prescribe for another country how best they can exercise their lawful right and indeed duty to self-defence, but as a friend we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Barry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday in Roppenstall I met with representatives of both the British Muslim and the British Palestinian community from East Lancashire. They were united in one voice, condemning the appalling actions of Hamas and the barbarous murder of the Jewish people. They will have been heartened today to hear the Prime Minister's words that we both stand with British Muslim community and the British Jewish community at this very difficult time. They want to see Israel comply with international law. They want to see humanitarian corridors remain open to enable innocent Gazans to escape. Could the Prime Minister say how the deployment of the British Royal Navy could help in ensuring that that happens?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this will be something that's important to my right honourable friend, and like him, we recognise that this is a moment, as I said, of anguish for the British Muslim communities who are appalled by Hamas's actions but fearful of the response. And as I said, we mourn the loss of every innocent life, civilians of every faith, every nationality who have been killed. Our Navy assets can help, as I said, ensure that illegal arms shipments don't find their way to people like Hezbollah, but also the assets that we're deploying next week will be there as a contingency and can provide humanitarian assistance if and as required, which I think will be a valuable contribution to the role we can play.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We in Walthamstow stand in solidarity with our neighbour who is here today pleading for help to get her elderly parents back who were brutally taken hostage by Hamas. We are also desperately worried about families from our community who are stuck in Gaza, UK citizens trying to get home. We believe that every life deserves the protection of international law and anyone who breaks it should be held to account. But my constituents are also asking what more we can do and to use our internet connections. The Prime Minister will have seen today it was reported that the Qataris have brokered a deal to ensure that Ukrainian children taken kidnapped in Russia have been returned home to their families. Can he tell us what conversations he's had with the Qataris about whether they might play a similar role and stop the violence in Gaza accordingly?
I'm sorry, some people are going to have to be disappointed. There is no way that we're going to get everybody in. The questions are far too long to help. Prime Minister, and answers hopefully can be speaking.
Thank the Honourable Lady for her question and assure her that we're talking with all leaders across the region. And I'm due to speak to the Qatari leadership, maybe even today, to ensure that we can work with them and others to ensure the safe return of hostages, but also to de-escalate the situation.
Blake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I refer members to my register of interest concerning my visit to Israel and Palestine in May this year? The median age of a Palestinian in Gaza is 18. In the West Bank, it's 21, and in Israel, the median age is 29. If we don't sort out this long-term conflict quickly and permanently, we're going to have generations of young people affected in both Palestine and Israel, more radicalisation and more tragedy for families living in these countries. Can my right honourable friend elaborate further on his comments of a peace process that will have a lasting impact and a two-state solution?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because Hamas has tried to kill off that notion of a peaceful settlement for the Middle East, peace and stability for Palestinians and Israelis, security for both of those communities, that we must redouble our efforts to bring that about. And there's been very much the subject of the conversations that I have had and will continue to have with leaders around the region. In any way that we can contribute to that, we will.
George Howard, Sir George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister and my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, for the statements they both made at the beginning of these proceedings. I wonder if the Prime Minister could give some indication of what role he sees for the United Nations in terms of providing much-needed humanitarian relief in the region, particularly in Gaza, and also in trying to get a new peace process off the ground, which I know will be difficult, but is badly needed.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind comments, and I think the United Nations can play a significant role when it comes to the humanitarian side. Indeed, around 3/4 of our existing aid to the region is channelled through the United Nations, particularly the Relief and Works Agency referred to before, and I'm sure they will continue to play a valuable role going forward.
Shelbrook.
Mr. Speaker, Leeds has a proud Jewish community, indeed in my own constituency, and it's not just the barbarity that we saw in the Hamas attack of burning and murdering and mutilation and rape, but it's also the fact that we came through several years where anti-Semitism had been given a safe space in this country. It's also that there are now protests on the street which are pushing forward the anti-Semitic message, and my constituents, my Jewish constituents, are fearful, and they are every day worried about how they go about living their normal life. So may I thank my right honourable friend for the £3 million of investment that he's announced for security, but can I ask him to keep a close eye on whether more will be needed, because I cannot emphasise enough that the Jewish community in my constituent across the country probably is fearful all the time.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his comments. He's rightly a champion of the Jewish community in his constituency, and like him, I'm clear that there is zero tolerance for anti-Semitism in the UK. We will continue to do everything we can to ensure the security and safety of our Jewish citizens.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand with this House in condemnation of Hamas's appalling killing of innocent Israeli civilians and call on the immediate safe return of all the hostages. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm very concerned with the increasing numbers of deaths of innocent Palestinians. The forced mass displacement of Gazans are leading to a massive humanitarian crisis. So can the Prime Minister explain what the government are doing to prevent this, and has he demanded immediate ceasefire to end collective punishment of civilians?
No, well, Mr. Speaker, I actually believe we must support, absolutely, Israel's right to defend itself and to ensure that attacks like this can't happen again. But as a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, and we will provide humanitarian support.
Henry Smith.
I was contacted by a constituent who was deeply disturbed on visiting London on Saturday at pro-Hamas chants that were being shouted about the destruction of national monuments, about the fact that the main stage for the protest was right next to the cenotaph, and media reports of somebody with a Union Jack being detained and led away. What representations are going to be made to the Mayor of London and the Metropolitan Police so that future protests are appropriately policed?
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have ensured that the police have the tools, powers and guidance that they need to police these protests appropriately. Obviously, this is a difficult situation. I'm thankful to them for what they did over the weekend. They've made, I think, over 20 arrests. And as I said, they're currently reviewing footage of some of the things that we've seen after the fact, and where they can, they will make further arrests. But we are clear. People may be free to express their views, but where they are inciting racial or religious hatred, that is against the law, and they will meet the full force of the law as a result.
I'm going to finish at 5:30, so let's help each other. Sir Owen.
Mr. Speaker, the Archbishop of Canterbury over the weekend said the price of evil cannot be paid by the innocent. And yet, in Gaza, Palestinians have had no access to food or water or electricity for over a week. We have seen an evacuation order which has left people with an impossible choice. Constituents in Luton North have spoken to me about their pain and anguish at the unimaginable loss of lives in Gaza, so many of which are children, all following the despicable attack of terror carried out by Hamas. Even at times of war, there are still laws. So, as well as the urgent and desperate need for humanitarian aid in corridors, what are ministers doing to counter breaches of international law that risk further loss of innocent life, along with the possibility of peace in the Middle East?
Mr. Speaker, it's Hamas alone that is responsible for this conflict, and we support Israel in taking action against terrorism and to defend itself. And Hamas has also enmeshed itself in the civilian population in Gaza and is using them as a human shield. Now, we will continue as a friend to call on Israel to do everything it can to reduce the impact on human life, and we will continue to support the area with humanitarian support.
Andrew Slow. The case that Israel's best hope for its future security and its justified response to Hamas's atrocity is to treat the civilian populations in Gaza and the West Bank with the full respect that the laws of war and civilised nations demand, or else this tragic cycle of violence will simply repeat itself in the years to come.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. We must, as I said, support Israel's right to defend itself, to go after Hamas and recognise that they face a vicious enemy that is embedding itself behind civilians, but they will do so in accordance with international law, and as a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Colm Eastwood.
Can I join with the Prime Minister in strongly condemning the despicable, horrendous acts by Hamas last week? It was and is an ongoing war crime. Of course, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, one war crime does not excuse another. So will the Prime Minister please speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu and ask him to stop dropping bombs on innocent children in Gaza? Some of us know all too well that unspeakable violence should not be met with unspeakable violence. We know in Ireland that the only option is to relentlessly pursue peace through dialogue.
Mr. Speaker, I'd refer the honourable gentleman to the Israeli President's words, where he's been clear that Israel is working and operationally according to the rules of international law, and they will exercise their lawful right to defend themselves, and as a friend we will continue to call on them to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Douglas Ross.
Speaker, the barbaric terrorism at the hands of Hamas saw babies and children robbed of their futures in the most brutal way. The victims were male and female, young and old. One of the victims was Bernard Cowan, who moved from Newton Mearns to Israel. And last week, his mother, Irene, joined many others at a service of solidarity and lit a candle in his memory. So we grieve and think of all the victims and indeed all of those families of the hostages. Can I also ask the Prime Minister that Jewish communities in Scotland are worried about their safety? So what action can and is the UK Government doing to ensure that Jewish communities in every part of the United Kingdom feel safe at this terrible time?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for everything he's doing to support the Jewish communities in Scotland. I agree with him. There's zero tolerance in our society for anti-Semitism, which is why we've provided extra funding to the Community Security Trust to ensure the safety and security of Jewish institutions and schools and synagogues, but also clear guidance to the police so they can step in and take action where someone is breaking the law.
Talmajit Singh Nassi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. After the brutal terror atrocities by Hamas, which tragically led to the deaths of over 1,000 Israelis, the government, of course, has a duty to defend its citizens, but it must be proportionate and in line with international law. We must also condemn any indiscriminate killing or forcible eviction from their land of the Palestinian people, who have suffered so much for several decades and now are facing horrors on an unimaginable scale. Does the Prime Minister agree that there must be no collective punishment of Palestinians? We must strive for peace, and there should be a humanitarian effort by the international community to avert a crisis furthering.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are working with our partners to bring humanitarian support to the region, and again today announced a significant increase in our humanitarian funding for the region, coming on top of what is strong support already, and we'll continue to talk to partners about how best to ensure that humanitarian aid finds its way to the people who need it.
James Gray.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I warmly commend the Prime Minister for the strength and clarity of his statement and his support for Israel, his condemnation of Hamas and his deep, deep concern for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Can I also thank him for being so strongly supportive of the Jewish and Israeli communities in Britain? But is he aware of an organisation called Palestinian Action, who have this weekend listed a series of companies and the directors of those companies who they believe to be legitimate targets for terrorist action? Will he now name this outfit Palestinian Action? Will he condemn what they're doing? Will he ask for the police and the Crime Prosecution Service to act without any further delay to deal with them?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his kind words. I'm sure he'll understand that arrests are an operational matter for the police, but obviously what he said on the face of it sounds concerning. The police have powers under the Terrorism Acts of 2000 and 2006 to make sure that they arrest people who are supporting either terrorism or indeed prescribed terrorist organisations, and I would expect them to use the full powers available to them to prosecute people under the law.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our thoughts at this time must above all be with the Israeli and Palestinian civilian dead and injured and with the hostages. According to Medical Aid for Palestinians, over 2,700 Palestinians have been killed so far in air attacks, more than a quarter of them children. This is before any ground invasion. What practical help can the government offer the 2 million people of Gaza and the UK citizens, like my constituents, who are trapped at the Rafah border and under constant threat from bombing and shelling?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we continue to be in dialogue with partners, notably the Egyptians, about the Rafah crossing, and we already, in anticipation, have deployed a border force team to Egypt to safely bring people home if and when that crossing is opened. And in the meantime, the FCDO are providing consular assistance to all those families who are in contact with them who are currently in Gaza.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his very powerful statement today, and like colleagues across the House, join with him in condemning the acts of Hamas. Hamas, Hezbollah and a multitude of other terrorist organisations get their logistic, administration, financial and armament support from Iran. Can he assure the House that he will act with our international partners to do everything to isolate Iran and to increase economic sanctions?
Madam Deputy Speaker, Hamas is fully responsible for the appalling act of terror that has taken place, but Iran does pose an unacceptable threat to Israel, including through its long-term support for Hamas, Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and I can give him that reassurance. We are working with our allies and have been for a while to decide how best to deal with the destabilising actions of the Iranian regime in the region.
Brandon O'Hara.
Speaker, I echo the Prime Minister's unequivocal condemnation of Hamas and their appalling acts of terrorist violence. International humanitarian law demands that any Israeli response must be legal and it must be proportionate. So does the Prime Minister agree that regardless of the circumstances, a collective punishment against an entire civilian population, one which involves forced displacement, the cutting off of water, food, fuel and medicine, can never be legal or proportionate?
Mr. Speaker, I believe we must support absolutely Israel's right to defend itself and to go after Hamas and ensure its security in the long term, and that acts like this cannot happen again. As a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Leicester is home to a large and vibrant Jewish community. There are neighbours, there are friends, there are families. It's also home to a sizable presence from the BBC, who, when faced with child murder, rape and torture, decided that Hamas should be called militants rather than terrorists. The political leaders of this country and our royal family can decide that they're terrorists. Why can't our national broadcaster?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. I absolutely endorse those describing these attacks, calling them what they are, attacks of terror by a terrorist organisation. Now, he will know the BBC is editorial and operationally independent of government, but the Culture Secretary has raised this issue directly with the Director General, and we wait to see.
Kate Osama.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by saying my thoughts go out to everyone affected by the terrible violence in Israel and Palestine. And I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his additional funding, humanitarian aid. But what I would also like to ask and press upon that he integrates a framework of atrocity prevention into the UK strategy to ensure that UK officials are able to properly centre its treaty and ethical obligations across its response to the crisis, and resource UK country teams and relevant officials with urgent atrocity prevention and response training, expertise, guidance and leadership.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I know the existing support that we provide to the region ensures the stability of the Palestinian Authority, for example, and helps build capability there. And the new money we're announcing today, we will work with partners to make sure it can be used in the most effective and quickest way possible.
Nicola Richards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, 2 weeks ago at conference we were brought to tears listening to Hannah Lewis, a Holocaust survivor, describe watching her mother get shot in the head at the age of 7, a scene that broke her heart and broke ours too as she spoke. 5 days later, Holocaust survivors were kidnapped or killed, babies slaughtered, women my age raped next to the bodies of their friends and then killed, hostages paraded through the streets of Gaza and spat on. That was the reality that unfolded in front of Holocaust survivors and their families. My own member of staff shared the story of his 10-day-old cousin who was surrounded by Hamas trying to murder them. So will the Prime Minister join me in utterly condemning the acts of Hamas, and will he join me in saying that we will never forget, and that never again really does mean never again?
Yeah. Can I thank my honourable friend for her powerful statement and for all the work that she does to support this cause in the country, and just agree with her wholeheartedly in condemning this act of barbarity unequivocally, but also saying there is no place in our society for anti-Semitism, and she is right, we must never forget, and praise her work and the work of the Holocaust Educational Trust and others for making sure that we never will.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish the horrific terrorist attacks last week by Hamas had been truly exceptional. But the truth is, they reminded me of what the Russians did in Bucha last year in Ukraine. And it also brought to mind the fact that the first place that the Russians targeted in Kyiv was a Jewish cemetery. There is a pattern here, and actually there's a network around the world. So whilst, of course, we have to make sure that Israel is able to do everything it can to defend itself, and we stand with every single person, either with a friend in Gaza or a family member in Gaza or a friend in Israel in this country who will be going tonight terrified as to what's going to happen to their relatives in the next few days, we also have to tackle this network, don't we? That means, in particular, having some tough words with Qatar about why they have hosted so many people from Hamas over these recent years, doesn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his powerful words, but also say to him that we will continue to speak to all people in the region, all leaders, to find ways to de-escalate this crisis and make sure that we can bring about an end to the evil that Hamas represents. And he's right, it isn't just limited to this particular conflict, it is much more widespread than that, and that's why we need to work with our allies to stamp it out across the world.
David Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Hamas is an Iranian proxy terror organisation and designated as such under the Terrorism Act of 2000. Credible reports indicate that the attacks of the 7th October were planned in concert with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Honourable members have for many years been calling for the proscription of the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, and those calls have been repeated today. And whilst I understand that the government does not indicate in advance what action it intends to take under the Terrorism Act, may I assure my right honourable friend that if honourable members were to wake up tomorrow morning and hear on the news that it had been so designated today, they would be extremely relieved and grateful to him.
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend that Iran poses both an unacceptable threat to Israel but also a destabilising influence throughout the region, which is why we have sanctioned more than 350 Iranian individuals, including the entirety of the IRGC, but also our new National Security Act gives us the powers we need to keep us safe here at home, and I can assure him that we will continue to work closely with our allies in finding the best possible way to contain Iran's pernicious activities.
Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I represent one of the biggest Jewish communities in the country in my constituency of Hampstead and Kilburn. And following on from Hamas's brutal attack on Israel, there's been an increase of anti-Semitic incidents in my local area. Most heartbreakingly, I've had emails from local parents who are very worried about their children going to a local Jewish school in my constituency because there's been aggressive men standing outside taking photos, and some of the parents have had their car tyres slashed as well. I know that the Prime Minister has pledged support to Jewish institutions, but could I ask him to commit publicly to make sure this support actually reaches local Jewish schools, and could he provide some much-needed reassurance to the local parents in Hampstead and Kilburn?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes an excellent point, and that's why I visited a Jewish school in North London this morning to make sure that the community there knew that I will do everything I can to keep them safe. That's why last week I met with the Community Security Trust to do an excellent job, and we provided them with extra funding, who I know they will ensure that it does get to the front line, whether that's schools, synagogues or other institutions. We will continue to do everything we can to keep our Jewish community safe, and what's happening to our school children is simply unacceptable and sickening, and we'll work very hard to bring it to an end.
Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I think it is disgusting to choose the day after the massacre to go outside the Israeli embassy and start waving Palestinian flags. I also find what happened at the Cenotaph disgusting. But those who are explicitly pro-Hamas are on a different level. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that it's important to work with the Home Office, and where it is possible, for these individuals to be deported if it is possible, because they do not share our values and that they are not welcome in this country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the military wing of Hamas has been prescribed as a terrorist organisation by the UK for some time, in addition to the political wing more recently. And once a group is prescribed, then it is then a criminal offence for people in the UK to do various things in support of that organisation. That's under the Terrorism Act of 2000. And furthermore, the Terrorism Act of 2006 created an offence of the encouragement of terrorism. This gives the police the powers and the tools they need to arrest those individuals who are perpetrating this kind of support, and I will ensure that they face the full force of the law.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I utterly condemn the barbaric attacks by Hamas and call for the unconditional release of all those taken hostage. These are horrific acts of terrorism and they constitute war crimes. Israel does have a right to self-defense, but the collective punishment of the people of Gaza is also a war crime, and those two things can both be true. The killing of over 2,600 civilians by the IDF is not only a humanitarian catastrophe, it also risks driving the deadly cycle of violence still further. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement that he's straining every sinew to keep the flame of peace and stability alive. So will he listen to those UN experts who are calling for a ceasefire? And what more will he do to promote a renewed international effort towards two legally recognised separate states safe within their own borders?
Mr. Speaker, I'd just say to the Honourable Lady, it's that vision of a safe, secure, two-state solution that Hamas has tried to kill off with its terrorist atrocity over the past week, and that's why I absolutely do support Israel's right to defend itself. It must be able to go after Hamas, to take back hostages, and to strengthen its security for the long term and ensure that this can't happen again. Now, as a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, and we will continue to work with international partners to bring humanitarian support to the region.
James Sunderland.
Madam Speaker, given the appalling terrorist atrocities and violent events of the past 10 days, not to mention the division that we're now seeing on our streets, does the Prime Minister agree that it is time for cool heads, for dialling down the rhetoric, for restraint and for objective leadership right across the political community, with a view to providing humanitarian support in Gaza, defeating Hamas and bringing people home?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, those are all absolutely the right objectives, and we are working on all three, particularly working with regional partners to de-escalate violence, but also bringing humanitarian support to the region, but also thinking about a brighter future where people can live peacefully and securely side by side.
Chris Stevens.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Prime Minister, as well as the discussions he's had with his international counterparts, tell us what discussions his government's had with international aid organisations, particularly around ensuring that if the Rafah border is open, to allow for a humanitarian corridor that aid is successfully coordinated? And has there been a discussion about who will take responsibility for displaced Palestinian civilians who will have nowhere to go? And does he support the principle those Palestinian civilians have the right to return home at the earliest opportunity?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud that we've been a long-standing, significant supporter of aid to the region and have regular dialogue with agencies like the UN. Indeed, our support to the UN directly helps around 5.8 million Palestinian refugees every single year over the past few years. We've announced an increase in that funding today by around a third, which is significant, and we will work with partner agencies to find the most effective and quickest way to get that aid to the people who need it.
Sir Simon Clarke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in unequivocally condemning the barbarity of Hamas, I associate myself with the remarks of my right honourable friend from Clwyd West a few moments ago about the IRGC and Iran. Can I ask specifically about the aid we've pledged today for the Palestinians? Clearly, we've seen that Hamas has been misappropriating aid, including using piping designed for water to fire missiles at Israel. How will we make sure that aid that goes into the Gaza Strip isn't actually used to strengthen Hamas?
A very good question from our honourable friend, and something that we review very carefully and monitor very carefully. We channel the vast majority of our aid in the Palestinian territories through the UN, and it is almost overwhelmingly on humanitarian purposes, health, education and the protection services for Palestinians. We do not provide any bilateral financing aid into the region, so that should give him some reassurance. But of course, with the new investment we're announcing today, we'll make sure that it goes on the things that we care about to the people that we care about.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree with the Prime Minister that Israel's response needs to be constrained by international humanitarian law. What steps will the government be taking to monitor compliance with those constraints in the coming days? And how many days do you think it will now be before urgently needed humanitarian relief can be taken into Gaza?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we're doing everything we can to support humanitarian efforts, moving aid into the region as quickly as we can, and we'll continue to have conversations with all our counterparts in the region to make sure that that aid can get there as quickly as humanly possible.
Mark Logan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I stand with my constituents in Bolton by condemning the acts of terror committed by Hamas, that they have not only targeted innocent adults, but even more barbarically, children. The government, at the onset of the horrific atrocities, rightly reaches out its hand to the victims of unspeakable terrorism. And does the Prime Minister agree with me and my constituents that the people of Gaza must be treated fairly within the bounds of international law, and that we refuse to accept an all-out humanitarian crisis?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we do support Israel's right to defend itself, and as a friend, we will continue to call on Israel to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians and do everything we can to bring humanitarian support to the people of Gaza as quickly as practically possible.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The targeted killing of civilians, whether Israeli or Palestinian, must be condemned, as must the kidnapping of hostages. The civilians of Gaza should not be made to pay the price for the atrocities of Hamas. Blocking children's access to food goes beyond self-defence. It's a violation of international law, while the World Health Organization has described forcing patients to relocate from hospitals as tantamount to a death sentence for some. Will the Prime Minister do all that he can to convince the Israeli government to cancel the relocation order, lift the siege and end indiscriminate bombing?
Just gently point out to the Honourable Lady that it's not Israel that is deliberately targeting civilians in Gaza. It's Hamas that is enmeshing itself in the civilian population and using people as human shields. And she talks about people moving. Again, Israel is attempting to minimise the impact on civilians by asking people to leave northern Gaza. And it's Hamas who is telling people to stay and again using them as human shields.
Matt Warman.
Deputy Speaker. We should all have no time for those who express sympathy for the terrorists of Hamas, and we should have no time for those who amplify their horrible messages either. Will the Prime Minister join with me in welcoming the actions of the Technology Secretary in trying to call the social media giants to account, and will he join with me in encouraging them to go cooperate with the police in this country in their investigations, and in making sure they do the same to try and minimise their impact abroad as well?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his excellent point, and more broadly just make the point that online offending is as serious as offline offending, and we do have robust legislation in place to deal with threatening and abusive behaviour, or behaviour which is intended or likely to stir up hatred, and this applies whether it takes place online or offline. We're working closely with the police and indeed the internet companies to make sure that those who break those rules meet the full force of the law.
Holly Lynch.
Following the horror of Hamas's appalling terrorist attack, it is crucial, as others have said, that we distinguish between Hamas and innocent Palestinian civilians in line with international humanitarian law. The UNFPA says that there are 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, with 5,500 due to give birth this month. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what efforts are being made to ensure that Gaza's hospitals are protected, able to operate for those pregnant women, newborns, children and all others who need urgent medical attention?
This
the will of Israel and the West as they seek to destabilise the region. So can I urge them to work with the US and other allies to ensure that they will not succeed, and that we will show the same resolve on this era-defining moment as we did with our support for Ukraine?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for what he said. He's absolutely right. We must stand resolutely with Israel, but also our allies like the US, to demonstrate that terrorism, Hamas's terrorism, will not prevail, and we will ensure not only can they defend themselves, but we can work with partners to bring about the peace and stability to the region which everyone living there deserves.
Karen Buck.
Speaker, the barbarism unleashed last weekend is unparalleled in the history of the State of Israel, and Israel unequivocally has the right to defend herself. And yet it remains the case that half the population of Gaza are children under the age of 18, of whom around 500 are believed to have died already, with UNRWA warning that their ability to provide relief is running out today. Can the Prime Minister, and I welcome very much the additional aid provided, can the Prime Minister use every channel to drive home the message that humanitarian aid delayed risks being aid too late?
Yes. I can assure the Honourable Lady that we're working very hard with partners across the region to bring humanitarian aid to the people who need it as soon as practically possible.
Order. I'm sorry, I know that a lot of people are disappointed that they haven't been able to ask their particular question, but the House is grateful to the Prime Minister for having been at the dispatch box for 2 hours, and I must point out, I'd like to point out in advance to all those colleagues who will come and complain to me that I haven't called them, that the House has been asking the Prime Minister to use his diplomatic skills to the best of his ability on behalf of our country, and I think we must release him from the chamber to allow him so to do. Thank you, Prime Minister. Point of order. Well, points of order come after statements. Is it directly relating to the statement? Then I hope it is really a point of order. Point of order, Hannah Bardell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank you for granting me the point of order. Given the importance and the magnitude of this issue, and I do appreciate that the Prime Minister was at the dispatch box for nearly 2 hours, nearly 50 members did miss out. Because of the complexity and nature of our questions, can she do everything she can to assure us that there will be time afforded to us the rest of this week and going forward to debate and discuss this very important issue?
The Honourable Lady makes a perfectly reasonable point, and the Leader of the House is in her place and will have heard. Oh, would the Leader of the House care to answer?
I know that the Foreign Secretary and his colleagues are making themselves available to speak to colleagues. So we're very aware that people will have constituency issues, and I know that the Foreign Secretary and his colleagues are doing that.
Very grateful to the Leader of the House for giving that immediate answer. I hope the Honourable Lady and the rest of the House will appreciate that ministers are doing their best to make themselves available, especially where there are particular issues relating to constituents. And so I hope the House will settle down, because there's quite a lot of chatting going on as we move to the next item of business, and that those who are leaving would please leave. I'm just going slowly for a minute, that those who are leaving would do so quietly and swiftly. Thank you. As we move on to the next statement, for which I call the Lord Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to make a statement on the criminal justice system.